Thank you very much, Mr. Hariharan. And thank you also to Professor T.R. Subramania, my very senior colleague and very distinguished scholar of international law, and also the Dean of the CMR Law School for inviting me to deliver this lecture on the application of international law by Indian courts. I also wish to thank all the colleagues in the Faculty of Law at the CMR Law School for providing me this opportunity, and also all students, everyone who are assembled here today through this, through this session to listen to few of my views and sharing of my few of my views on this particular topic. My reason for actually taking up this topic for discussion is twofold. One is I've been working on this for quite some time, have written a bit, and then also it interests me a lot because of my background, perhaps working with the Ministry of External Affairs and also working more on a practical note, continuously dealing with these issues keeps me, and also working on state practice with not only with the Indian Journal of International Law, will along with many of my esteemed colleagues and teachers, and also with the Asian Yearbook of International Law for many years. We have been working on this issue of Indian state practice, how India actually looks at international law, in particular how Indian courts seek to implement the international aspects when they are actually delivering judgments. This is an ongoing work. I mean, it's not going to end because every year we look at judgments as they come, how actually judges look at it. I might, of course, I have done this with even judges as well. There are a number of critiques I'm going to give you also because, our courts are looking at it, and particularly Supreme Courts and High Courts are looking at international law, sometimes correctly, sometimes wrongly. So let's be very fair to them. Now, coming to the first point, I mean, to I'll speak. I don't want to give a PowerPoint presentation or anything like that. About an hour or so, I'm going to speak, share my sort of random thoughts along with the substantive aspects, and then we can have last about 15-20 minutes for discussion and answer question and answer session. I'm sure there will be many who will have their comments, views, perhaps may agree with me, may disagree with me, on these issues. We will have it at the end, maybe in another hour. I think we can go up to 1:30. So I should finish by 1:10. I think my random thoughts on these issues. Now, the first question actually I always ask is why domestic courts are increasingly using or ruling on international law. That's the first question. Indian domestic courts. Now, this is of course, Indian Supreme Court, the higher judiciary, Indian Supreme Court, and the high courts are looking at it at different points of time. And secondly, it is because, how do you define international law also matters actually. Everything which you deal with sometimes has an international element. It could be it could be core international law relating to immunities, diplomatic immunities, or it could be relating to some violation of human rights or some other implementation of a particular treaty. There can be many areas which are could be regarded as core international law, where courts may have to deal with exclusively with international law. But there are areas where courts necessarily deal with without knowing that they are dealing with international law, because many of the legal frameworks, many of our domestic laws, many of our the transactions which take place, either contractual or personal laws, etc. They have an element of international law, in the sense, it could be private international law, an element of an international element will be there. Even that could be regarded as international law related aspects. So, in other words, in recent times, particularly last 15, 20 years, the definition of international law per se has broadened. So obviously, when we started studying international law some 3 decades ago or so, the conceptual understanding of international law was very limited. It was, we used to take general principles of international law, basic issues relating to international law, like international organizations, like the relationship between the state, immunity, diplomatic immunity. We thought these are highly state centric and they are essentially could be regarded as international law. So international law was not something to do with nothing to do with domestic law. As essentially that was the idea some 2 3 decades ago we had. But in the last 1 or 2 decades, this actually has really changed. Because without knowing international law, it is extremely difficult to study the existing domestic law framework. Because majority of the legal frameworks which are coming today have had an impact of international law. International law, either it could be through conventions, multilateral treaties, or even procedural issues. You know, these have to be harmonized into domestic law because maybe you can say the increasing interaction between people, globalization, all this must have resulted in a necessity or requirement for bringing in, international law elements into domestic law. So we have changed our laws in many ways. So domestic law, for example, the best example we can always look at is, all of you I'm sure are also familiar, is the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996. So this was brought in 1996, almost more than 2 decades ago. The preamble to this act itself mentions that this act was modeled uh, on the framework, legal framework, international legal framework given by the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. Essentially, more than 90% of this particular enactment, Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996, Indian Act, which repealed the then existing 1940 Arbitration Act, actually conforms to the UNCITRAL model law on arbitration and conciliation. So, you have, because this is again, if you look at this way, nearly 50 to 60, or now more, maybe more, 70 countries around the world follow the same model actually. If you look at the major provisions of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, most of the countries follow almost similar model. This has got advantages because of the increasing globalization, increasing interaction between people. Then when you have a common sort of an understanding on many of the concepts, then it is easier to actually predict the global trade, international trade, and then also to enter into agreements, international agreements, etc., at private levels or between two private parties, including even with the investors and private parties, investors and the state. So that is the reason why I think in recent times it has become inevitable for states to modify or bring in this kind of a change in their domestic law. Almost even in 2006, it was one of those articles written in Harvard Journal of International Law by Annie Mary Slaughter saying that the future of domestic law is, or even the future of international law is domestic actually. So that is what exactly people are looking at it. Most of the international law is now imposing the way the framework of domestic law has to be actually applied or made. This is quite evident if I give you again examples from the areas of trade related aspects of intellectual property rights within the World Trade Organization, one of the agreements, and many other such treaties and agreements. If I give you examples, you will understand that even within India, changes have actually been brought about in order to make it in compliance with the existing international law, knowingly or unknowingly at some times. Now, That's the first thing. Then what do we mean by domestic courts, in India? Now, I'm sure this is a very simple question, but I think all of us know as students of law, of course, starting from Supreme Court, High Courts, even the lower judiciary. So, we have a system of courts. All of them could be regarded as the domestic courts. In international law, we call them municipal law system. So domestic courts will take it as a broad definition, but at the same time, we concentrate. Most of this conceptual application or interpretation of law happens at the level of higher judiciary, at the level of high courts or the Supreme Courts. So I think even then, it is not proper for us to negate the work even done by the lower judiciary. Even lower judiciary, district courts, session courts, and many of these courts, including some of the mofussil courts, as I've seen, or most of you might have seen during your internships, etc., deal with some aspect of international element at some point of time. I mean, they may not do it on a day-to-day basis, but still you'll find them dealing with it, once in a while, and it is increasing. That is the most important part. So now, how do domestic courts use, as already mentioned by my friend here, Hariharan already mentioned that essentially international law is used as a supplementary means of interpretation. Of course, there are problems we know as students of law, international law, that international law cannot be part of domestic law straight away. I mean, it's one of the major topics of discussion, study, how international law, can become part of domestic law. In other words, here is a sort of an example where we could see international law works in a particular sphere and domestic law or municipal law, as we call it, works in a particular sphere. Both work in an independent sort of a spheres, and they have their own ways of assimilating both either domestic law or international law into each other. So, in other words, here we are looking at a scenario where we have some 190 plus territorial jurisdictions, states, whatever it is, whatever is their system of law. But we have almost 100, 200 countries around the world having their territorial jurisdictions, legal systems, which have evolved over a long period of time. And on the other hand, you have international law, which actually is between states, but now it has actually been expanded to also to have it could be individuals, international organizations, and it can be, it is now into a sort of a, more sort of a liberal attitude towards its approach to enter domestic law. So international law also has its own sphere. But how do you bring international law into domestic law? I'm sure all of you are very aware in international law. This is one of the most basic issues we discuss. International law, when it has to come to domestic law, it has to be incorporated into domestic law, or it has to transform itself into a domestic legislation. These are the transformation theory and incorporation theory are quite well known in international law. This has been quite studied as one of the topics that is between relationship between international law and municipal law. So obviously this is an issue which is a little technical in the sense, and many a times I'm sure even in Indian courts, many lawyers and judges make mistakes in this regard. Actually, you know, of course, the courts are increasingly using it. Courts are increasingly referring to it, but at the same time, courts, when it comes to the application of first the application of looking at law, what law should be applied, then they will look at domestic law as a first priority. That's the basic issue. Domestic law, is there any domestic law, is the main sort of approach of courts when they are actually functioning is to look at the application of existing or violation or non-violation of the existing domestic law. What law is, has been violated? tell us, is it violation of constitution? Is it in violation of any of the existing laws? This is what exactly the courts are going to ask you. You can't, when you go before a court, I'm sure you can't say, honorable, judge, it is violating international law. Nobody is going to say that actually. You can't go before a judge and say that it's in violation of WTO agreements, it's in violation of some other international treaty. But you can bring in, actually, it has happened in many cases wherein courts have taken cognizance of these treaties and then multilateral treaties, etc. For example, one of the best examples you have in recent times, about almost 7, 8 years ago, Navratil's judgment. Navratil's judgment relating to a particular product, drug, which was not granted patent in India because it was in violation of Section 3D of the Indian Patent Act, where it did not grant patent rights to an already existing, patent, or something in relation to the already which it had patents in a different form. So obviously, Navratil's case is an example where the Navratis went to Madras High Court first time, told them that besides other thing, this Section 3D is in violation of WTO, norms, particularly the TRIPS agreement. The Madras High Court, in so many words, very clearly said, we are not concerned with what is TRIPS, what is WTO. Of course, we know, but it is for the government of central government, the executive, to look at it. But for us, tell us, is it okay with Section 3D of the Indian Patent Act? Is Section 3D in violation of the existing, constitutional requirement, etc.? If it is fine, it is fine with us. Similarly, it went into the appeal into Supreme Court, where it was discussed at length. Some 80 or 100-page judgment. It's quite a elaborate judgment mostly relating to the history and therapeutic use of the drug, etc. But you can see some traces of international law here and there. So that's one example I want to give you, actually, relating to how courts are going to look at it. The primary concern of the courts generally is to look at domestic law, but that's not the end of the story. Now, as I already mentioned, there are a number of ways courts actually would like to use international law. As already mentioned, to fill the gaps in the law, or to how do they deal with international law as inevitable due to impact of reach of globalization, and then towards uniform or harmonization of the law. So all these are an objective in which it is being done. Now, when the courts look at it, the lower courts in particular, we only think about Supreme Court, High Court, etc. There are a number of ways you can actually get the international law aspects or international legal elements into their work, which is very common. So let me give you a list of these areas where actually they will be using without knowingly or unknowingly. So for example, the observance of human rights in custody, for example. A foreign national has been arrested, or any other national who has been arrested, and when they are sent into custody, you require to observe certain minimum human rights. Sometimes it can be obligation of another country which is imposed on you, or otherwise it's an obligation under our own constitution or under our own requirements that you'll have to observe this kind of minimum requirements. Then you can also even look at implementation of foreign arbitral awards in India. Although arbitral awards can be implemented or enforced within India, now under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act as a decree of the court. So, but while implementing it, you will find courts interpreting the various provisions of the 96 Act and also taking elements of international law into the discussion. I'm sure every year, Supreme Court or even many high courts come out with at least plethora of discussion decisions on the implementation or enforcement of foreign arbitral awards. The next is going into more personal laws now, because we are in a very different world these days. So people are moving, people are, going from India to other countries, settling down there, marrying there. Sometimes they, this is a big issue now. There is a huge amount of problems going on there. For example, it's relating to matrimonial cases and issues concerning maintenance. you know Maintenance issues have come up, which is in large number in some states like Punjab. It's a very big issue where the maintenance issue, particularly after marriage, and then concealment of certain facts before marriage, all these are very important issues and have international law elements, particularly private international law elements, and this will have to be decided by the district courts or lower judiciary. Now, the bail application for foreign national with sureties, how to go about doing it in case if it's a foreign national. Obviously, you have an obligation to inform the concerned embassy or the consulate, which actually will have to look at the issue. So obviously, anywhere in the country, if somebody is caught for various reasons, somebody is for a criminal offense, then you can't treat them like any other, if he is a foreign national, like any other person of the Indian origin. So you'll have to take care of those things. And again, you have international law elements coming in there. These are all done by the lower judiciary. I'm not talking about High Court or Supreme Court. Internet crimes at sometimes, where somebody is posting something, this is happening all the time. So where the server is located in some other country. Now, of course, in the recent cases, you have seen the issue of guidelines and then asking for compliance officers regarding the Twitter, etc. You are looking at this. This is again something which is entirely international, but through an application of a domestic legislation. So there are both elements are actually are there. So courts, of course, or even the executive will have to look at it. Then extradition matters, I don't have to explain. Extradition, currently, the kind of things which are going on in other countries, and the complications which it could arise, because when you take a citizenship of another country, allegedly citizenship, whether you are a citizen of that country, whether you can, once you become citizen there, how can you can renounce the existing citizenship. All these are very complex issues and involve both international elements and domestic law elements. Then you have the most important element is, which sometimes we overlook and very important for lower court, is service of summons in foreign jurisdictions. Even for Supreme Court, this is a problem actually. I remember I was working as a legal officer for many years in the government. Even the Supreme Court had no idea as to how to service summons outside the country. They know how to do it within the country, but they have no idea as to how could be, under Indian Civil Procedure Code, you have to have the proper serving of the notice. Actually, serving of summons has to be complete. When can you term it as complete? Particularly in the foreign jurisdiction, when you cannot locate somebody who has embezzled with certain, cash or money, or who has done some fraud in India and has gone abroad and has disappeared in some country, and then he's there, and you have to issue, as banks obviously will have to take care of their own problems. So obviously they have to file a case, and then they have to issue a summons. This person is no longer is in India. So how do you service summons? It can be done through diplomatic channels. Then you have Section 44A of the Civil Procedure Code, which actually has reciprocal arrangements with some 50, 60 countries where it can be automatically served. Or in case if you don't have reciprocal arrangement with these countries, then you will have to use your diplomatic channels, talk to their concerned Ministry of Law and Justice, and then take recourse to the laws of those countries, and then service the summons. Again, this involves just not domestic law, international law elements. This is again lower courts, because unless you serve the summons properly, under CPC, that case cannot go on. That could be otherwise become a glitch in the entire process of judicial approach towards how actually it should be effectively done. So then the enforcement of intellectual property rights. This is another important issue. Even today, when you're talking about standard essential patents (SEPs), and then the number of patents which actually are there in a given subject matter. It's pretty complex now because in India, for example, a mobile which we have is not some single entity which actually carries number of different kinds of intellectual property rights, and these are owned by a number of different companies, corporations, and then it's very complicated. And there are standard setting organizations which actually decide the what are called as FRAND rules under which this can be granted. And this is again international. We don't know. This is again what could be termed as somewhere between hard law and soft law, which is again a unique international law concept. We don't have hard law, soft law idea in domestic law. All guidelines, declarations, and then arrangements. This could be termed as soft law, but there are areas in international law which become hard law over a period of time. I can give you a number of examples. There are a number of good writings on this, but even in domestic law, it's very difficult to have this kind of a categorization. Declarations, guidelines. These are guidelines. Obviously, courts are not going to take cognizance of this unless there is a sanction or a strength of a parliamentary legislation. So this is another area where you can see. I'm just giving you a list of ideas, where you can think that lower judiciary. I compiled them over a period of time. So through discussions with our friends in the lower judiciary, possibly who are actually working in lower judiciary as judges, etc. So I was working. I mean, when we were working together in the National Judicial Academy in Bhopal. So recognition and dissolution of marriages that had been solemnized in foreign jurisdiction. That's a very complicated issue. Either people get married in India to Germans, or getting married and going back to Germany, and then asking for a certificate of marriage, or people, it happens all the time in Canada, for example, where you have an Indian diaspora, which is very big. So they get married here, and then, but they are Canadian citizens. They can be US citizen. The nationality issues come up because two people of different nationalities, when they get married in a third country, then it becomes a very complicated issue regarding the maintenance or the dissolution of a marriage or the validity of a marriage. So this is a very big problem. So again, you have private international law coming in there, and lower courts are looking at it. Breach of contracts suits, especially when these suits are dismissed in other foreign jurisdictions, is a big problem actually. How do you look at this? Breach of contracts, and then when they are dismissed, whether Indian courts should look at it afresh, whether Indian courts, then you will have to look at the judgments, then the decree passed by the foreign jurisdiction. It's a very complicated issue. I have mentioned in my writings, it's there in my writings, so you can look at them. The articles which I have shared with the colleagues. And of course, intercountry adoption is another area where, of course, is a big problem. I mean, there are decisions by the Indian Supreme Court as well. And then breach of confidentiality by multinational corporations. I don't have to explain Rafale deal or many other deals, where confidentiality issues become very key between corporations when they are actually supplying certain kinds of technology. And particularly now, the data which we are generating today relating to the pandemic vaccines, clinical trials, and how you actually are going to keep this data with you, and whether you can share this data with the other company. For example, whether AstraZeneca should share Covaxin's Bharat Biotech clinical trial data, and how this data can be used in other jurisdictions. For example, Bharat Biotech is actually filing for its clinical trial stages in US. So obviously, those data has to be kept confidential. clinical trial data, which is a big issue even under the TRIPS agreement, Article 39. So long time back. This is nothing new issue. But this is an old issue, but this needs to be, again, will be discussed at a lower judiciary level. And child custody cases and alimony rights. For example, there are Hague Conventions on Private International Law, which are well known, where you have abduction of children. Abduction, not in the sense of abduction, it's called abduction, but when one of the parents, one of the spouses come back to India with the child and the other fellow files a case in another country where he is, in either in US or Canada or in any of the European countries, anywhere. So then that becomes a problem. There are a number of cases again decided by the Indian Supreme Court where child custody issues become an important international issue, and they have to be decided under the Hague Convention, Hague Convention on Hague International Conference on Private International Law, to which India was not a party till recently, but now because of even today, it's not a party, but there is still a debate going on, and some orders have been passed even by the courts, Punjab High Court particularly, and also by the Law Commission has examined it as well as to what should be done. This is a very important issue. Environmental issues, granting of injunctions, etc., particularly when it comes to investment related issues, investor state disputes, where, of course, some of these issues have come up. And of course, that's one of the reasons why India has actually abrogated all its treaties. I mean, renegotiating them now because of the problems which it has actually created. And you have citizenship and nationality issues, which are, I don't know to explain. These are again have to be decided at the level of under the Indian Citizenship Act by the lower courts, and district magistrate has certain rights, certain obligations to decide some of these issues. So obviously, this is a matter which is nothing. I mean, of course, it might come up to high courts and Supreme Court at a later point of time, but these are again dealt by the lower judiciary. Refugee status determinations, although it is done at the different levels, but even matters have gone before the lower courts, and determination issues of different parts of the country actually. And then I mentioned with, of course, although this has not come into Indian courts as of now, but interstate water disputes also could be, particularly when you are bordering with another country. Also, this is one of the contentious issues under the Convention on Non-Navigation Use of Water Courses. This is a 96 UN convention adopted, where it became controversy, Article 33 in particular, where when you have a fact finding and whether a third country can have, your neighboring country can have access to your courts when there is a violation of some of the agreements or provisions of the, existing law or existing international agreement. India declined, and India had its reservations because it's, I don't know to explain why India declined. And India abstained from voting for this convention in 96. And obviously, this is another very contentious issue. But there are a number of other countries, like in the European context, they give access to the nationals of other countries to take recourse to the violation of such water-related issues. For example, in case if you are, polluting the water resources and allowing it to flow into the other country, obviously, what should the other country do? Take it diplomatically, or should it actually could sue you in your courts? For example, in case if it's happening in Hooghly or in Brahmaputra or somewhere, can Bangladesh sue India for violation of some of the some of the constructions which it is making? China, for example. So I don't think any country will do it, but it's an important issue where countries are allowing their sovereignty to be diminished and allow these people to come in. And then, Kudankulam is another example, nuclear power station, which is standing near in Tamil Nadu, where Sri Lanka had some problems with it. So these are transboundary issues. I'm sure there are a number of issues on which international law has given rights for other states to do it, but so far Indian courts have not taken note of these things without the proper intervention of the executive. So these are, I'm trying to give you sort of an out sort of a blueprint, sort of examples as to how not only high courts and Supreme Court, even the lower courts actually can deal with some of these issues. Now, I have coming to the other points. For example, how about the in my analysis, I usually make the distinction between, if you look at the Indian courts, application of international law by the Indian courts, there are three stages actually you can examine, which I have done in my article also. The first is between, immediately after India became independent in 1947 and up to 1970. That's one particular period, 1947 to 1970, where India had to deal with number of difficult international law issues, particularly relating to boundaries and such related issues. Because of this is the aftermath of partition. This is what happened. Then from 1970 onwards up to 1990, you have number of different kinds of cases which I have discussed in my article, which relate to more social and economic related issues. If you look at the cases which have come up, so you have people like, P.N. Bhagavati, Professor Upendra Bakshi, and then Sheila Barse. I have listed all those cases actually in the footnote, where you have from territorial disputes, etc. You are actually getting into more social, economic, and related issues, which are environmental issues, of course, have become very important. So this happened between 70 to 1990. From 91 onwards, there is a perceptible change in the approach of the courts in dealing with international law. What you could have got as a inspirational, for example, Krishna Iyer, to many people were there in the 70s and 90s, but in the post 90s you will find, there is a different approach because of the economic approach which India took. So I suppose that's one reason many people attribute it to it, because of the liberal economic approach or our approach towards development. And many of the decisions which have come up, particularly from the Indian Supreme Court, do not actually reflect the kind of international legal approaches which we could actually see. I mean, they are very different. In the court, trying to defend development, not environment. Court trying to, which of course, exceptionally few cases could be Vellore Citizens or Intellectual Forum. Even there, the court went on to say things which are quite interesting, in the sense, in some of these cases, court, I'm sure you refer to Kuldeep Singh's, Justice Kuldeep Singh's quotation, but Justice Kuldeep Singh also referred to precautionary principle, sustainable development, then intergenerational equity as customary norms of international. I'm sure Professor Subramania will agree with me, because he has worked on these areas. These are not customary norms of international law as of now, because there are conflicting views which states have on these issues. It's a very difficult issue. And international law, let me tell you, this is where courts are going haywire actually. Courts are making a major mistake in understanding what is customary international. And it's not easy to understand customary international law. International lawyers, as international lawyers, you can't call a declaration, arrangement, guidelines accepted by some 100 countries as customary norms of international. It cannot be. Customary international law, which is accepted by all countries, there can be no derogation from this. Only few norms under international, like piracy, genocide, and some of the concepts under international humanitarian law could be regarded as accepted as customary international law. That, under human rights law, you have there are a number of categories of human rights, first, second, tertiary, those kinds of rights are there. So obviously all of them are not equated in one go. So where I think the lawyers, I mean, I don't blame the judges per se, but even the lawyers actually who have no proper understanding of these things actually make submissions which are actually wrongly attributed and then quoted by the judges as part of accepted norms of international law. But still, I think more or less the Indian Supreme Court, as you can see, is very clear about what it actually wants to do with regard to international law. And it also, again, I have said it and written it also about it, depends on the judges also, actually. Some judges are very receptive, very, I can mention them. For example, SB Sinha is one of them who gave that entertainment, that super cassettes case in 2008 or 2009, where of course he gave out some of the conceptual understanding. This is a case relating to a copyright violation of the FM radios, or trying to using all kinds of music without paying royalty, and he had to deal with that case. And then India had number of party to number of copyright conventions, etc. There he came out with guidelines and then provided, he was very receptive and then very progressive sort of a judge in that sense to give recourse to international law. But actually, what happened by the courts, initially coming back to my original sort of a discussion on the territorial disputes, socio-economic disputes, and then the post-liberalization dispute. There are three categories which I mentioned to you. The first encounter of Indian courts relating to international law happened in a very more traditional context, more substantive context. Now, it began with territory because the Berubari cases, which happened in the 50s and 60s, Berubari, it was a legal advisory opinion by the court. Reference was made by the President of India in the 1950s, which resulted in the Ninth Amendment of the Constitution. The simple question was whether the executive had the power to adjust the boundaries of a state on its own. For example, the enclaves that existed between India and Bangladesh, when two prime ministers went and then looked at it and decided to adjust the boundary a bit, can that be done by executive, or should it be a constitutional amendment for any change in the territorial thing required? So this was a question actually which went on for 2 decades. Now here comes the some of the basic issues before I really get into the cases. For example, our constitutional scheme is very clear about how we look at international law. Now, I don't have to spend more time. Hope all of you can hear me. There is any problem?
No, sir. Sorry.
Yeah. So here the question is in the constitutional scheme. Of course, let's begin with more general. Article 51 of the Indian Constitution simply talks about, in general terms, international law should be respected, foster respect for international, endeavor to foster is in a more sort of a, and also settle all disputes amicably through arbitration, should have a good relationship with all the countries, and then respect international law and international treaties. This Article 51 is a very general kind of an approach which was given, which is within Part 4, which is the Directive Principle of State Policy, and which is Article 51. Article 51C in particular refers to international law in per se. But the exact problem came, regarding this territorial issue, where the Indian Constitution was examined in the Maganbhai Ishwarbhai Patel was Union of India in 1969 properly. This is a relationship between Article 73, Article 253, and Article 246. These are the three, elements we should know, whoever is applying courts. For example, Article 73 spoke about the executive powers of the central government to enter into a treaty and agreements, which is the power which central government has. And in relation to Article 253 and 246. Now, 253 and 246, you must know, is located in Part 11 of the Indian Constitution, which deals with the distribution of powers between the states and the center. So where a federal structure? So that's the problem. So now 253 very clearly says it is in case the executive goes and signs a treaty or ratifies a treaty, in case if when they do that, in case if there is a requirement for any amendment because of the obligations which we incur, then in it is a parliament which will have to pass the legislation or amend the legislation. So now you have a problem here. Problem is you have a article 253 where of course article 73 executive has the power, but article 253 confers power on the parliament under its supervision to amend or implement the existing international law obligation which an executive has concluded. So there is a sort of a mismatch. This was actually examined by the Venkatachalaya Commission in 90s when, there is a very good report which is available on the net also, you can see, and how treaty making power in India requires a bit of a change because there are a number of treaties, this is because, if you, those of you who have worked in treaty matters, 90% of the treaties we have no problem actually. They are more sort of a, uh, exchange of information, exchange of experts, academic exchange, cultural exchange. These are okay. I mean, obligations are quite fine. You can do it. 90%, because when there are two dignitaries who are actually visiting certain countries, then they have to exchange certain treaties and they have to do some Photoshop sort of things. Then obviously treaties are done. So these are done. That's okay. But there are 10% where you have a real problem actually, or they create obligations. If you're becoming party to climate change negotiations, or if you're becoming party to WTO, if you are actually bringing in a new liability, joining a liability convention relating to nuclear liability, etc., this can be really a problem because this creates obligations, not only financial obligations, it requires changes in the legislation. That's the most difficult part. Here, even I can say financial obligation is not a problem. You want to pay some $50,000, $70,000 as part of some problem, you can pay. There is no, but when it comes to amendment of legislation, new legislation, that's a problem. There you need to explain to the cabinet and to the parliament as to why do you actually know. That's what happened within the WTO agreements, TRIPS agreement, for example. We had to change the patent law 3 times. We brought in a copyright law with so many amendments. We changed our trademark law. We brought in a new Geographical Indications Act. We brought in a new, we don't have a Trade Secret Act actually as of now, but we brought in updated Designs Act. So we have amended our laws, including labor laws. We have brought in changes in many of our, as recently as few months ago, we have brought changes in Arbitration and Conciliation Act 96, Section 87. This was challenged before the court, a very recent one. Then also we have brought in the insolvency codes. And Section 87 of the Arbitration Conciliation Act was challenged before the court in the context of the new insolvency code because that created problems for many of the public sector undertakings. So this is where exactly we have a problem in relation to the application of international law in terms of the amendment. You're becoming a party to a convention, then that obligation is more onerous obligation. So you have to be very careful there. So this is where most of the treaties concluded under Article 253. So there is a problem there, but Article 253, Article 246, of course, is also under Part 11, where you have union list, and then under 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, union, state, and concurrent list, where under the union list, entry 14, of course, this is quite well known, gives executive the power to enter into treaties and agreements. There are a number of other provisions as well under the union list, which actually takes care of the existing international obligations. Executive is given the primacy, but executive at the same time can't overdo 253. He has to take it to the parliament when you have to introduce a new law or amend the existing law. So now this is why I'm saying Magan Bhai discussed this issue actually. The Magan Bhai, this was the problem first time the relationship between all the three articles were discussed in the Maganbhai Patel case in 1969, which was about the adjustment of the boundaries. In Berubari, the court had said that you need to have an amendment, but in Maganbhai, the court took a different view. In case if it is just an adjustment and it is not for the courts to intervene when there is a problem at the international level between executive, that should be taken care by the executive between two prime ministers. Then if there's a small adjustment, if you want to make, you can do it actually. So this is the number of cases actually. The Berubaru 2 is Ram Kishore Sen versus Union of India. Again, it's a 1950s case. There are at least 3 or 4 cases: Berubari 1, Berubaru 2, and then Maganbhai. Then we go to the well-known, gramophone in 1984, which dealt with some of the basic issues. Again, it was relating to importation of a gramophone, some of the materials which had to be taken through Indian sort of a transit route through Nepal. There was a problem with relating to, Nepalese, the cargo house, where this was a problem. Gramophone, India versus the Biren Bahadur Pandey. This was a 1984 case. It was a classic case where again this was discussed. But I think it was till 1997. In other countries, if you look at trend text, where I've discussed this in my writings, where the Lord Denning very clearly said, which UK jurisdictions are generally very, very traditional, very, very conservative. But Lord Denning came out with a view in 1977 itself, saying that in case if there is a change at the international level, in case if there is something which the courts will have to accept that change, there is no point in waiting for a legislature or somebody to, look for. I think the courts have an obligation to implement them seriously and quickly. That's what Lord Denning said. I have quoted those things in my writings. But it took India another 20 years, 77 in England and 1997 in Vishaka versus state of Rajasthan, where there was no law on the subject relating to the harassment of particularly women in workplaces in India. We didn't have a law. Now it was Justice Verma, who actually looked at the human rights aspects and came out with a judgment wherein they said, in case if there is a gap in the law, in case if there is a requirement to fulfill the requirements of the law, then you can take recourse to this interpretation. So I don't know whether we moved away from transformation to incorporation. That was the discussion, where court need not wait for transformation of a legislation into an international obligation or international treaty into a domestic obligation. So that is what exactly the Vishaka did actually. And then after that, I think the third phase from 90 onwards, there are a number of decisions which have come up wherein the courts have taken a little bit, the world view, which is not like the Indian socio-economic view, but they have tried to harmonize our viewpoints with the existing global world. For example, the courts have said, of course, this was said earlier also by the courts in famous ADM Jabalpur, where one of the courts which said, in case if there is a international treaty which cannot be implemented because of its inconsistency with the domestic law, then you should take, if it is amenable to 2 or 3 different interpretations, the international treaty, you must take that interpretation which is more consistent with our domestic law. This is what exactly one of the, IDM Jabalpur and all that cases said. But the best came in the SB Sinha's decision in the super cassette case, where he said, even J.S. Verma said before, said in case if there are provisions of international law, can be mostly in human rights and environmental law, which are consistent with our basic structure or basic tenets of constitutional law, the Indian Supreme Court can take cognizance. This is the last mile where our courts can go actually. As long as what we have, this is where you can say India has actually moved away from transformation doctrine to the incorporation doctrine, almost American style. But I don't think courts are still conservative. They'll ask you for a domestic law. But if you could show that there are human rights, environmental norms, there are other norms which are consistent with the constitutional guarantees, violation of Article 21, violation of Article 14. There are a number of cases where courts have said, okay, then we'll take cognizance of these treaties and then obligations which India has, in order to implement them. Of course, up to a point, customary international law. So now this has been said even in the latest, the Enrica Lexi case as well in 2013, when the court had to deal with maritime zones issues, where exactly it happened, whether India is jurisdiction. Of course, it has now gone into other fora. It's been decided now. But Enrica also was one issue where courts took a more liberal view of how India can actually look at some of these issues. So now, as you look at the latest developments, this happens every year. I mean, implementation is always an issue for the courts. And when you look at the Indian approach, the Indian approach has to be developed. Now, last point I come to is how should we do it actually? How should we bring in more? The last point is how to more sensitize courts, lawyers to use some of the best elements of international law. Obviously, lawyers do use, as I mentioned to you, in many of their aspects. But at the same time, because of the elements, because of the global nature of the transactions, it could be arbitration. Arbitration is widely used. I mean, most of the lawyers I know, most of the most senior lawyers are quite well aware of the developments in the area of arbitration, but they are not well aware of the areas in other areas. Actually, there are some lawyers who are, of course, very well aware of the issues relating to environment and other human rights. Of course, humanitarian law. Of course, there are people who are quite well aware of these developments. But courts are little conservative in the sense whether to approach these things directly as part of taking international as part of our domestic legal system. That frontier has not been crossed as yet, in my view, by the Supreme Court. The maximum they have gone is, I told you already, Constitution. If it says, Article 21, 14, or any of the basic tenets of the Constitution is if it is consistent with that, I think then we can actually use them as a supplementary means of interpretation, or bring in case if there is no law on the subject like what happened in Vishaka, I'm sure you can take recourse to it. And now you also must remember that when it comes to Article 37 of the Constitution also refers to extraterritorial application of laws. Tax matters, for example, in a Avani Lloyd case in 2006, I think, also another case where India wanted to tax certain transaction which took place on the Bombay High off the coast of Gujarat and Maharashtra, where the certain transactions took place, delivery of certain products happened. So now whether India can tax those things, and Vodafone is another example where India taxed and that Vodafone judgment is pretty complex judgment, talks about the corporate structures which exist around the world, how actually they construct this kind of a web of corporate structures in order to avoid taxes, how India can actually look at it. So now Vodafone is a good example, but Vodafone doesn't refer directly to international legal principles as such. So I think there are a number of cases court is struggling to handle these matters in greater detail. But I think it all largely depends on how, as lawyers, all of us, judges are not someone who actually would be doing all these things. It is for the lawyers, students like you, teachers like us to, to look at these issues incorporate them in our writings and judgments or preparing our briefs, then I'm sure the courts will be very happy to look at it. There are a number of very very sensitive, very good judges, or at all levels, including high court and supreme court and lower judiciary, who will be very happy to look at them. But it's also depends how do you present them actually. How do you present them? How do you make your arguments consistent with the existing legal principles? So, this is my last point. The last point is that in order to do that, you need to know international law very well, basic principles of international law very well, and not make any mistakes. And then logically, and it's very important. Now, there is no other way you can actually do it, because everything these days involves international law elements. I mean, sure, if you look at I told you already, because of the existing globalization technology, which is global, which is there, and then which is affecting all of us in many ways, new laws have come, and that needs to be interpreted in the light of the best interests of the humankind. So, whether it is environment impact assessment, or any other law for that matter, which all will have to, or biodiversity. I mean, there are a number of judgments from Uttarakhand, had two cases which have come up in the last few years, recently as well, regarding the biodiversity convention, sharing of benefits, etc. These are, of course, little controversial, little mistake they have made, but still, I think it's a good attempt. I think, and secondly, these judgments will have to be written carefully, because now globally people look at various judgments. We look at South African judgments, Australian judgments, Brazilian judgments. I'm sure Indian judgments are also examined, looked at by various scholars around the world. So that's why I think state practice is very important. All of us need to study this topic seriously, and then examine. Most of us know, of course, what happens in US and US Supreme Court, US courts, and then also European courts. Of course, European human rights courts, or even the other European institutional courts which actually deal with these issues. But we need to know also the developments which are taking place in other jurisdictions like South Korea, Thailand, within Asia, South Asia. I'm sure all of us are doing that. Many countries are doing that. So it will also, because similar conditions exist in many of our countries, then we can take care of problems, which I think our court is doing up to a point, but I think not regularly. This is lack of strategy, or sometimes, of course, as lawyers, we don't do it because we need to get the output, and the result is more important to the client than what actual development of law. That happens very rarely, but sometimes it happens, I think. So, having said this, let me stop at this stage. I had few things, more things to say, but I think I'll stop at this stage and then leave things for discussion where we could actually handle some of these cases. So, in sum, I would like to say at the end that the application of international law by the Indian courts, which began as something more substantive in relation to territorial and other kinds of disputes, has now actually is gone into areas which are very important in the context of globalization, or increasing importance of India in the global area. So I think that's where we are going, and I think as lawyers we have a responsibility to take care of these issues in the coming years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable insights and giving us an international perspective of how important it is, because global lines are blurring today and every business is going global. Whether it was the Veritas case, or whether it was the gramophone case, or whether it was the biodiversity case, I think all these cases gave us an insight as to how important international law, which has seeped into our Indian judiciary today, and hopefully the students have learned a lot. Now we'll open the chat for questions. If anybody has a questions, please leave it in the chat box. So we already have 3 questions. The first question is by Akshya. She asks, can a person committing a war crime become a refugee?
Yeah. So, can a person committing a war crimes become a refugee? I'm sure you have the answer. I don't have to explain. So, war crimes are, there is this question of universal jurisdiction. Okay. So, this is being debated even within the United Nations. So, war crimes are, of course, of the nature of universal jurisdiction. Piracy, war crimes, and then number of even genocide. These are all, and then of course he has to be tried. Any court can try, any country can try actually, or he will have to be sent back to those country where, of course, he's the national of that country. So obviously that is the answer actually, simple straight answer.
Thank you, sir. The next question is,
Codification of law treaties. Yeah. Second, I can read it actually.
sure, sure.
Kritika Vinod is asking, is there a possibility of codification of law of treaties? It's been codified actually. Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties, 1969. It has been codified by the International Law Commission after a long debate. But the only thing is India is not a party to this treaty. India has declared saying that we will abide by the provisions of this treaty. So India, and secondly, what has been codified in the 1969 Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties (VCLT) is essentially a customary, most of it customary norms of international law. I'm sure I don't have to explain. About. Of course, the International Commission is dealing with many of other topics relating to that actually. Now, Sriniti is asking if Parliament has made any legislation which is in conflict with international law, then Indian courts are bound to give effect to which law? Obviously, this is a very simple answer is Indian courts will give effect to the Indian law. Even if India has made any legislation, Section 3D example I gave you, Nauratis, I have explained. According to Nauratis and many others, this is in violation of the TRIPS agreement. But Supreme Court said, High Courts have said that, if it is consistent with our, approach, our legal regulations will give effect to that. So obviously, as of now, the European courts have taken a very different view. I can tell you, American courts have taken a different view. As of now, Indian courts are giving effect to the Indian law. Obviously, if it is even in conflict, there are a number of decisions which have come up in case if there is a conflict between a treaty, and generally there will not be, but they will try to avoid such conflicts. But if you ask me straight question, I'll tell you it will go by the Indian law. That's an obligation for the Indian courts. Then the backdrop of the changing dynamics of international law, do you think that, who is asking this question? Jayashri Pradhan is asking this. The backdrop of the changing dynamics of international law, do you think that India's foreign policy has also changed? If so, how? Does it have a role in the decisions of Indian courts? Or do the courts generally only look at treaties, laws, and conventions without much emphasis on the foreign policy in general? And then, of course, it goes, could you also suggest some online sites we could follow wherein we could read and keep up with the recent decisions and developments in international law? And finally, how can we read our articles? Last one, of course, I've already given the articles that will be circulated. 2 articles, which are available, of course, on the net as well. But I have already mailed my article to the coordinator that, of course, you can take care. And this is a very interesting question, I must say, dynamics of international law and foreign policy. See, this is a debate which happens, in my School of International Studies in JNU all the time. This is a problem we face all the time. This is a good question, I must say. We have let me put it in more lighter way. We have I'm sure Professor Subramanian also knows, we have a Center for International Politics diplomacy, and international organization, which is just above us. And we are international law departments. There is a constant tussle between both of us. So, what is the tussle is about? They say law, international law is dictated by power. That's what they say. Power politics. The politics, this international politics dictates the annals of international principles, development of international legal principles, etc. But on the other hand, we argue it is law which is required to tame the power, actually. It's the other way around, actually. That's why there is law. That's why, when the Americans went to Iraq, they had to take recourse to Security Council finally, although it was violation, because there was no collective security system because their occupation of Iraq became illegal because they had not followed the requirements which is accepted under international law. And there was a big debate which went on for a few years. And finally, the Americans had to take recourse to Security Council. Even then, America became an occupying power. When you become an occupying power under international humanitarian law, you have certain implications. So that is what exactly has happened. Obviously, whatever you do as an occupying power, you are actually responsible as occupying power, including it could be war crimes, actually. So any violation, anything happens within. So Americans are responsible. So now they had to take recourse to Security Council, but only exception for use of force is Article 51, and then of the United Nations UN Charter, and then collective security system. When the Security Council authorizes, then you can do that. So obviously, foreign policy also impacts or gets impacted by international law, because generally, unlike in domestic law, where every country wants to justify its existence by legal means. For example, to give you an example, like South China Sea, award, which was given by an arbitral tribunal, in which China decided, I'm not going to participate, and it said this is a piece of paper, it should be put into the dustbin. And this is what exactly China said about the arbitral award. Now it has gone somewhere else. Let's not get into it. But China had to do. But what did China do? If you look at what exactly China did when the arbitration was going on, China was holding a press conference in Hague outside, provided all the details as in when although it was an ex parte hearing, China took all the care to provide all the details to the world community and try to justify its action through legal means. In international law, unlike in domestic law, where you have a sanction, in international it's called compliance. States generally comply, generally try to show that we are in tune with the existing legal obligations, international legal obligations, where you can have two or more interpretations. So obviously, foreign policy does impact international law and vice versa. And of course, it's Indian courts also get affected. That's a very good question that needs to be examined as well, actually. Up to a point, Indian courts, foreign policy areas, policy matters, generally courts do not enter into. Generally, in case if there is a policy decision by the court to buy 100 Rafales, I don't think courts will say, why are you buying 100 Rafales? Why can't you buy only 20? That's not job of the court. But whether you have bought it correctly through a legal means, proper regulation, proper, procedural handle, that's what courts will look at. So there is this is of course the division of, separation of powers. We will have to understand. But even it happens to foreign policy also. And of course, the Srinivas Yadav's question is, an environment of the nation is dependent on how their people are treated. Places like Somalia, Afghanistan, the fear of their farmers are not letting them farm. So the guns and farming as connections, how do you think will solve them? It is always about Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. In between them, this terrorist, corrupt politician, there is no law, no UN or any ICJ supporting to free that places from this issue. It's a problem, yes, Somalia, Afghanistan, but I think, again, this is intermingling of politics and international law. Law can do up to a point, but in both in Somalia and Afghanistan, international humanitarian law principles apply, and then any violation by any of those countries can be held liable. And of course, I agree, these are very difficult sort of problems where you can't solve them, unlike even in India, within India, you can't solve them. How can you expect, but you need to put in place systems. Of course, there are a number of issues which have come up in the international United Nations, like responsibility to protect, and all these kinds of concepts have been brought in by the United Nations, which are by themselves controversial for various reasons. Countries and many scholars call it as intervention through a back door, and there are a number of problems. But although good intentions, like countries like Canada have brought in, but it has its own problems, and which is still being debated. So those are the things which have will provide countries with certain responsibility to help, what you're mentioning, Somalia and then Afghanistan, all these issues. But I think meetings, politics and law will have to go together in these issues. They do impact. And United Nations, that's why it has Security Council as General Assembly. In General Assembly, you have the 6 committees, and 6th committee is Legal Committee, which looks after all these issues. Secretary General prepares reports, and then actually these are conveyed to the governments, and then decisions are taken. So I think this is a bit of a, in international law, of course, there is a bit of a flexibility, and then it's not straightforward answer, but I must tell you that we need to work along the gaps which exist. And I think countries are much more responsive these days to these problems. I'm sure that should be the answer, and there can be many more possible answers for this question which you have asked, foreign policy versus international law. Mine is not the last answer, but that's what I feel actually. But that's a good, interesting question, I must say. Sumana is asking, in case of absence of a uniform international law, example in case of investment in Bitcoin and some countries legalizing such investment like US and some countries like China considering it illegal, what is the recourse? As of now, in India, there is a bill proposed to regulate investment in case of conflict between country where it is legal and other where it is illegal. What is the remedy? See, only remedy is you have to have a multilateral treaty. Countries should sit and negotiate. So all bilateral agreements, countries conclude. That's why India has abrogated its existing, not abrogated really, renegotiating its investment treaties, because it felt that these treaties are not in India's interest because of various reasons. There is a whole problem with investment treaties actually, which requires a longer session, and how they are actually developing sort of a interpretation which is sometimes in violation of existing international. You have to look at the issue of sovereignty, issue of countries, requirement to bring in certain changes in its existing laws, approach how in a country looks at certain things. Under international law, nobody will ask a question regarding a particular interpretation of the Indian law at the International Tribunal, which is taken as a fact. But in case if the arbitral tribunals go on interpreting it and then saying that this is in violation and we are going to give you compensation to the tune of some billions, then no country will agree to it actually. I mean, mine is a little conservative view, but there are people who are giving, if you read arguments from Professor Savarna Raja, who is one of the very well-known, authorities on this area, even Professor Chimney, Professor Anthony Engi, many of them have written on this investment issue, and there is a counter view as well. But I think we should be careful, and I suggest, those of you who are interested, instead of reading, ICSID and all those things, you must read the recent in discussion which have gone in Deloitte International Institute of International Law, which has had few sessions on investment law matters and how actually it is affecting, where Dr. P. Srinivas Rao, who was one of the former presidents of Deloitte International and then International Law Commission, actually is taking part. And they have a very different view actually about the investment law. So I think Bitcoin, I'm not sure. I think countries have to deal with it from their own viewpoint. Some are legalizing, some are not legalizing. India, I think, is very clear about its position on this. And something which is not very certain, which is likely to affect India's, India's interests. I mean, national interest. Finally, all of us converge, whether it is international law or international politics. And national interest can be defined in different ways, actually. But essentially, countries take their recourse to regulate all this, taking into account their national interest. And last point, I really want to tell you, this is what exactly the GATT Article 21 said as well. GATT Article 21 called security exception. In case, and then of course you also know the decision of the ICJ in the, some of the decisions. As a last resort, sovereignty is the supreme. So that's where exactly international needs to be understood. In the legality of nuclear weapon, this is what exactly the court said in the advisory opinion. When can you use nuclear weapon or no nuclear weapon? Finally, the court, after analyzing it, it's one of the greatest sort of judgments given by Justice Veeramantri from Sri Lanka. And finally, despite all such great judgment, they had to say that in case if a state is made to stand against a wall, hands tied, and there is no other way, then you can use nuclear weapons. I mean, this is what ICJ had to say finally, which is up to a point not correct, but up to a point correct. We don't know where it is. Because sovereignty, state, and the last point really is, yeah, of course, there are different laws. Koskenemi talks about fragmentation of international law. There is a whole report within the International Law Commission on this issue. So still we have different systems, different civilizations, different different kinds of approaches, and different territorial jurisdictions, and different national interests. So obviously it's a pretty complex area. And then the last point is, that's why international law, studying international law is a very, very difficult topic. You have to study both domestic law, you have to study international law also. Studying intellectual property rights, for example, if you're studying patents, it's from domestic law viewpoint, you can study patent law act and then few cases. But when you are studying patent law from international law viewpoint, then you have to know what exactly is TRIPS, what exactly is Paris Convention, what is exactly is Berne Convention, why that brought in. Oh God, this is a problem in international law. So international law is a must in order to understand how it actually shapes the domestic law, including all these other problems which you are referring to. I think that's the last question I have.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for answering those questions. I'm sure all of us have had a great learning experience from your insights. Thank you once again, sir. Now, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Subramania, sir, our Dean, to share a few words. Please, sir.
This is one of the wonderful lectures. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
This is one of the most wonderful lectures which is delivered by Professor Venkatachala Hegde. He has served in different capacities and immense exposure, both in India and abroad. And I can just tell you only one thing. Those who have heard with rapt attention, they can find at least 8 research topics. This is not for LLM dissertation, but for their PhD program. Each of the topics which he has raised and mentioned and discussed will be an independent topic for the PhD program, because research at the required level is not done. And it has to be done by youngsters like you, young teachers like you. That is the only thing I will say. And he will be with us, and he will, even in future, I welcome him. One important point regarding the last but one questions regarding the foreign policy, whether the foreign policy of the government of India has changed. So some question was there like this. I just intend to add to what Professor Hegde has said. Oh, I will give intend to give an illustration for this purpose. See, when Vajpayee's government came uh, after the elections in 2000, what had happened was the foreign minister of the state of Soviet Russia, Andrew Gromyko, was supposed to visit here. And Andrew Gromyko, remember, he was a seasoned politician and to a certain extent a statesman as well. Before visiting the state of India, he had visited the state of Egypt. And in the state of Egypt, uh, the president at that time was Nasser, was the president. Now, when he visited there, the foreign minister of Egypt, just before his visit, had visited India and met Vajpayee. And having met Vajpayee, he just gave a bit of information. And he pointed out that the present prime minister is very difficult to handle. Because I have met him and talked to him, and the foreign policy is on the verge of change in the state of India. Now, from Egypt, Gromyko was a foreign minister for 25 years, came to Delhi, and he was received. And afterwards, in the evening, there was a party, which is in the foreign policy matter, separately called as. Now, in this reception, which was given to the foreign minister, our prime minister was also present. And I just want to tell you the one statement which he has made. The statement is very simple. Mr. Gromyko, much water has flown from the Volga to the Ganges. We will come with you, but we will never come behind you. That is the clear indication of the change in the foreign policy of the government. Now, the more powerful we are, the more powerful our economy is, your foreign policy naturally will be dictated by our leaders. This was not happening earlier because in the initial stages, we have the foreign policy was one-sided. Because most of the time we have allied with a particular state. When you have in alliance with a particular state, naturally, remember, there is no growth for the future. Now, these days, we are good with almost all the superpowers, except some fight here and there with our neighbors. That is where you get a chance everywhere. And you get, remember, the benefits everywhere. You think of the COVID crisis, what type of resistance we have received from almost all the states, even the poorer states, poorest of them also wanted to give and donate something for the state of India. This virtually speaks about the re-emergence of the foreign policy of the state of India in between 1914 to thus far. Thank you. Professor Hegde, once again, I thank you. The very best of you all the time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Professor.
May I now invite Srinidhi from 4th semester LLB to propose the vote of thanks. Please, Srinidhi.
Thank you, Hariharan. Colin Paul once said, "No secrets to success. It is the result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure." On this note, a very good afternoon to one and all present here. I, Srinidhi, am honored to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of the entire campus. Let me first start by thanking Almighty for making this session possible. I would like to extend my most sincere gratitude to our Honorable Chief Guest, Professor V.G. Hegde, sir, for lending your valuable time besides your busy schedule. By providing us with your knowledge and insights about international law, we understood the depth and importance of the subject. And as you had mentioned about how domestic courts use international law as a supplementary means of interpretation and how it is present even in personal laws, you had further mentioned about the stages of application along with the landmark cases and had highlighted the territorial issues and the problems of this application in Indian courts. It was truly inspiring, sir, and helpful. And as future lawyers, this session was very informative and has helped us gain more insights about international law. I thank you once again, sir, for your kind words. I thank our Honorable Dean, Dr. T.R. Subramania, sir, for giving us this opportunity to be a part of this wonderful session. And a special thanks to our Vice Principal, Vijay Praneshwaran, sir, and the dignitaries of the school and the faculties of CMR. And last but not the least, I take this opportunity to thank all the students present here, without whom this wouldn't have been such an interactive session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay.
I thank everybody for attending this
Okay.
session.
Leave.
Thank you, Professor Vijay Hegde.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, sir. And I thank the Vice Principal once again.
Thank you.
I thank also all the students and other faculty of CMR University who attended this session. Stay home, stay safe, and stay healthy. Thanks a lot.